Orontes River, Qarqar, 853 BCE. In the year 853 BCE, near the ancient town of Qarqar, along the banks of the Orontes River in what is now northern Syria, the ancient world gathered for war. As dawn broke over the river valley, the land trembled beneath the movement of men, horses, and chariots. Dust rose into the morning light, carried by the sound of marching feet and the low thunder of war drums. Weapons of bronze and iron caught the sun, flashing across a battlefield that would soon be written into history. From the east came the army of Shalmaneser III, ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a power that believed conquest was not merely policy, but destiny. For years, Assyrian armies had advanced relentlessly, crushing cities, extracting tribute, and leaving behind monuments that proclaimed total victory and divine favor. To resist Assyria was, for most kings, to invite annihilation. Yet on this day, something extraordinary happened. Facing Shalmaneser was not a single city-state, nor a lone defiant king. Instead, arrayed along the plains near a town called Qarqar, stood a coalition of former enemies, rival kingdoms that had set aside generations of warfare to confront a common threat. Kings who once fought for land, trade, and honor now shared a single purpose: survival. Chariots from Israel stood beside infantry from Hamath. Warriors from Damascus aligned with forces from Phoenician cities along the coast. Never before had the fragmented powers of the Levant united on such a scale. It was a gamble born of desperation, a recognition that alone they would fall, but together they might endure. What followed was one of the largest battles of the ancient Near East, recorded not in epic poetry, but carved into stone by an empire eager to claim triumph. Yet beneath the bold words of royal inscriptions lies a deeper mystery. Did Assyria truly win at Qarqar? Or did this unprecedented alliance succeed in halting the march of an empire? This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of the first great coalition war in recorded history, a moment when the ancient world stood together and dared to resist domination. To understand why the Battle of Qarqar mattered, one must first understand the world that existed before it, a world shaped by fear, ambition, and the relentless rise of empire. In the early 9th century BC, the ancient Near East was a fractured political landscape, dominated by small kingdoms and city-states struggling to survive between powerful rivals. At its center stood Assyria, an expanding imperial power whose influence would soon reach from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Mediterranean. The Neo-Assyrian state had emerged from a period of internal weakness to become the most formidable force of its age. Its kings no longer ruled as mere regional leaders, they ruled as conquerors chosen by the gods. By the time Shalmaneser III ascended the Assyrian throne in 859 BC, the foundations of empire were already firmly in place. His predecessors had rebuilt Assyria's military strength, reorganized its administration, and revived an ideology that equated expansion with divine will. Assyrian kings believed that the god Ashur had commanded them to extend Assyria's borders endlessly. War was not only expected, it was sacred. Campaigns were launched almost every year, not merely to defeat enemies, but to extract tribute, silver, gold, livestock, timber, and captives. Cities that submitted were spared destruction, but bound into a web of obligation. Those that resisted faced annihilation, their fate recorded in chilling detail on palace walls. Beyond Assyria's eastern heartland lay the Levant, a mosaic of independent kingdoms stretching across modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. These states, including Damascus, Hamath, Israel, and Phoenician city-states along the coast, were politically independent but militarily vulnerable. They fought each other frequently over trade routes, fertile land, and access to ports. Their rivalries ensured that no single power dominated the region, but also that none could stand alone against a great empire. Economically, the Levant was immensely valuable. It controlled trade corridors linking Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and Egypt. Cedar wood from Lebanon, wine and olive oil from Israel, textiles and metals from inland Syria, all were resources coveted by Assyria. Control of these regions meant wealth, prestige, and strategic depth. For Assyrian kings, the West was not simply a frontier, it was a prize. Between 859 and 853 BC, Shalmaneser III led repeated campaigns westward. Each year, Assyrian armies advanced farther, subduing cities and forcing kings to kneel and pay tribute. Some rulers chose submission, hoping to preserve their thrones under Assyrian dominance. Others resisted and were crushed, their cities burned and populations deported. The message was unmistakable: Assyria was coming, and resistance was futile. Yet, as Assyrian pressure increased, fear began to reshape the political logic of the Levant. Kings who had once viewed each other as enemies now faced a greater existential threat. Tribute demanded by Assyria grew heavier. The presence of Assyrian armies grew closer. One by one, the buffer states that had once absorbed imperial pressure disappeared. By the early 850s BC, it became clear that the old ways, isolation, rivalry, and short-term survival, would no longer suffice. For the first time in recorded history, a new idea began to take shape: collective resistance. The road to Qarqar was not paved by ambition or unity, but by necessity. It was the product of a world pushed to its limits, a world standing at the edge of imperial domination, searching for a way to endure. By the mid-9th century BC, Assyria did not dominate through numbers alone. It dominated through organization, technology, and terror. The Neo-Assyrian army was the most advanced military force the ancient Near East had yet produced, and its reputation alone was often enough to force cities into submission. To face Assyria in battle was to confront an enemy engineered for conquest. At the heart of this system stood the king, in this era, Shalmaneser III, commander-in-chief of a standing army that could be mobilized year after year. Unlike the seasonal militias of many Western kingdoms, the Assyrian army was permanent, professional, and state-supported. Soldiers were equipped, trained, and supplied by a centralized administration capable of sustaining long campaigns far from home. Assyrian infantry formed the backbone of the army. Spearmen with large shields advanced in disciplined formations, while archers provided devastating ranged support. These archers were often protected by shield-bearers, allowing them to fire continuously under cover, a tactical sophistication rarely matched by Assyria's enemies. Increasingly, Assyrian soldiers were armed with iron weapons, giving them a crucial advantage over opponents still reliant on bronze. Chariots were the elite striking force of the Assyrian battlefield. Heavy, four-horse chariots carried archers and shield-bearers, combining speed, firepower, and shock impact. While chariots had existed for centuries, Assyria perfected their use, deploying them in coordinated attacks rather than isolated charges. Cavalry, still in its early development, also began to play a growing role, offering greater flexibility across broken terrain. But Assyria's greatest weapon was psychological. Warfare was designed not just to defeat armies, but to break the will of entire populations. Cities that resisted were subjected to siege, followed by mass executions, deportations, and destruction. Survivors were forcibly relocated across the empire, a policy that weakened resistance and supplied Assyria with labor. These acts were not hidden, they were proudly recorded in inscriptions and carved into palace reliefs as warnings to all who might defy imperial authority. Logistics further set Assyria apart. Roads, supply depots, and provincial governors ensured that armies could move quickly and remain in the field. Intelligence networks gathered information on terrain, defenses, and political divisions among enemies. Warfare became systematic, relentless, and predictably brutal. For the kingdoms of the Levant, this posed an unprecedented challenge. Their armies were smaller, often composed of short-term levies, and their political divisions prevented coordinated defense. One by one, they had watched neighboring states collapse under Assyrian assault. No wall was impregnable. No army seemed strong enough. Yet this very perfection of war created a paradox. The Assyrian machine was powerful, but it depended on constant success. A major defeat or even a failure to achieve decisive victory could disrupt the image of invincibility upon which the empire relied. At Qarqar, for the first time, Assyria would face not a single opponent, but a united front, and the true test of its war machine was about to begin. What confronted Assyria at Qarqar was something the ancient Near East had never witnessed before. A grand coalition of rival kingdoms united by a single, urgent purpose. In a world defined by competition, mistrust, and frequent war, this alliance was extraordinary not because of friendship, but because of fear. The rising power of Assyria had forced ancient enemies to recognize a brutal truth: divided, they would fall. At the center of this coalition stood Hadadezer, ruler of Damascus, the most powerful Aramean state in the region. Damascus had long resisted Assyrian encroachment and possessed the military strength, wealth, and diplomatic influence necessary to organize resistance. Hadadezer understood that his kingdom stood directly in Assyria's path. If Damascus fell, the rest of the Levant would soon follow. Alongside him stood Ahab, ruler of the Kingdom of Israel. Though later remembered primarily through biblical narratives, Ahab was, in his own time, a formidable political and military leader. According to Assyrian records, Israel contributed a massive chariot force to the coalition, a sign of both its resources and strategic importance. For Israel, Qarqar was not a distant conflict, but a fight for survival against a power that threatened to erase its independence. Other kings joined the alliance, each bringing troops, supplies, and local knowledge. Hamath, a kingdom that had previously suffered Assyrian attacks, committed infantry forces. Phoenician cities such as Arvad contributed maritime wealth and seasoned warriors, despite their traditional focus on trade rather than land warfare. Kingdoms from northern Syria and southern Anatolia, including Quay and other lesser-known states, added their contingents, swelling the coalition's ranks. What made this alliance remarkable was not just its size, but its diversity. The coalition included Arameans, Israelites, Phoenicians, and Anatolian peoples, cultures with different languages, gods, military traditions, and political systems. Some worshipped Hadad, others Baal, Yahweh, or local deities. Yet on the battlefield of Qarqar, these differences were set aside. Survival demanded cooperation. Assyrian inscriptions list the forces of the coalition in impressive detail, boasting of thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of soldiers. While these numbers were almost certainly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, they nevertheless reflect the scale of resistance Assyria encountered. This was no token alliance, it was a serious attempt to confront imperial power head-on. Coordinating such a force posed immense challenges. Command structures had to be negotiated. Troops accustomed to fighting each other had to learn to stand side by side. Supply lines had to be secured, and battle plans agreed upon. Any failure of trust could doom the entire effort. That the coalition reached Qarqar intact is itself a testament to how dire the situation had become. The decision to make a stand at Qarqar was strategic. Located near the Orontes River, the site offered open ground suitable for chariots, access to water, and proximity to key routes Assyrian armies would use. Here, the coalition could concentrate its forces and deny Assyria the advantage of fighting isolated enemies one by one. This alliance was not born of idealism or unity of vision. It was a temporary union forged under pressure, held together by necessity rather than loyalty. Yet in that moment, it represented a revolutionary idea that collective resistance could challenge even the mightiest empire. At Qarqar, these kings were not merely defending their territories. They were testing a new political reality, one in which cooperation might succeed where isolation had failed. Whether they would triumph or fall, the outcome would echo far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The march toward Qarqar was not a sudden clash, but the culmination of years of pressure, planning, and escalation. By 853 BC, the confrontation between Assyria and the Western kingdoms had become inevitable. Each campaign led by Shalmaneser III pushed deeper into the Levant, tightening the grip of empire and narrowing the options available to its rivals. Shalmaneser's western campaigns followed a calculated pattern. Assyrian armies advanced along established routes, securing river crossings, intimidating cities, and isolating potential allies before decisive engagement. The goal was not merely to win battles, but to dismantle resistance piece by piece. Cities were forced to submit before a fight ever occurred, their kings compelled to deliver tribute as proof of loyalty. But in the years leading up to Qarqar, this strategy began to encounter resistance. Instead of isolated cities surrendering one by one, Assyrian scouts and informants encountered signs of coordination. Tribute failed to arrive. Messages went unanswered. Intelligence suggested that armies were gathering not in scattered strongholds, but in a single, concentrated force. The coalition's leaders understood that allowing Assyria to choose the battlefield would mean disaster. If their armies were defeated separately, no city could hope to survive a siege. They needed to force a confrontation on ground of their choosing, where numbers and coordination could counter Assyrian discipline and experience. Qarqar offered that opportunity. Situated near the Orontes River, Qarqar lay along a natural invasion corridor used by Assyrian armies moving west. The surrounding plains provided open terrain suitable for large formations and chariot warfare, a critical factor, given the coalition's significant chariot forces. The river ensured access to water, while nearby settlements could support supply needs. Just as importantly, Qarqar stood as a symbolic line of defense. If Assyria crossed it unchallenged, the heart of the Levant lay exposed. As Shalmaneser advanced, the coalition mobilized. Troops converged from across Syria and the southern Levant, moving along roads that had once carried trade caravans and raiding parties. Former enemies now marched under a shared purpose, their banners raised not for conquest but for survival. The logistics alone were staggering, feeding men and animals, coordinating arrivals, and maintaining order among forces with different languages and command traditions. Assyrian intelligence almost certainly detected this buildup. Shalmaneser did not turn back. To do so would undermine the very image of invincibility upon which Assyrian power rested. An emperor who hesitated invited rebellion elsewhere. Qarqar, therefore, became unavoidable, the point at which momentum, pride, and fear collided. By the time both armies reached the Orontes Valley, retreat was no longer an option. The coalition had committed everything it could muster. Assyria had marched too far to withdraw without consequence. Between river and plain, beneath the open Syrian sky, the stage was set for a battle that would test not only armies, but the very idea of empire itself. The road ended at Qarqar. What followed would be remembered, not for its clarity, but for its consequences. What happened at Qarqar on that day in 853 BC was not preserved through eyewitness chronicles or heroic poetry. No detailed battlefield narrative survives. Instead, the battle must be reconstructed from fragments, royal inscriptions, archaeological evidence, and careful historical reasoning. Yet even through this veil of uncertainty, the scale and intensity of the confrontation are unmistakable. As dawn broke over the Orontes River valley, two massive armies faced one another across the open plains. On one side stood the Assyrian host, hardened by decades of near-constant warfare, advancing under the authority of Shalmaneser III. On the other stood the coalition, a patchwork force drawn from across the Levant, unified not by tradition but by desperation. The battlefield itself favored neither side decisively. The flat terrain allowed chariots to maneuver freely, while the nearby river provided water for men and animals alike. This was not a narrow pass or fortified city where Assyrian siege tactics would dominate. It was open ground, a place where numbers, coordination, and endurance would matter. The engagement likely began with long-range exchanges. Assyrian archers, protected by shield-bearers, advanced in disciplined formations, releasing volleys designed to disrupt enemy lines. The coalition responded in kind, though their archers lacked the standardized training and protection of Assyria's forces. Dust and smoke quickly filled the air, reducing visibility and turning command and control into a challenge for both sides. Chariots then surged forward. Assyrian chariots, heavy and powerfully constructed, charged in coordinated units. Each carried a driver, an archer, and a shield-bearer, a mobile weapons platform meant to break enemy formations. Against them rolled the chariots of the coalition, including a substantial contingent attributed to Israel. These lighter vehicles emphasized speed and maneuverability, darting in and out of combat zones, loosing arrows before withdrawing. The clash of chariots was chaotic and deadly. Horses screamed, wheels shattered, and fallen crews were trampled beneath the advance of infantry. Control over the battlefield shifted constantly, as neither side could secure a decisive breakthrough. Infantry engagements followed, with spearmen and swordsmen pressing forward amid confusion and noise. Individual acts of bravery mattered little in a battle of this scale. Survival depended on formation and cohesion. At some point, Assyrian forces likely attempted to exploit weaknesses along the coalition's line, targeting less experienced units or seams between allied contingents. The coalition, however, appears to have held. This alone was extraordinary. For an alliance of rival states to maintain cohesion under the pressure of Assyrian assault suggests careful preparation and determined leadership. According to Assyrian records, the fighting was intense and prolonged. The Qarqar monolith claims that Shalmaneser inflicted massive casualties, scattering the coalition and forcing them to retreat. Thousands of enemy chariots and soldiers are listed as destroyed. Yet these claims raise immediate questions. If the coalition had been decisively crushed, Assyria would normally have followed up with the capture of key cities, the deposition of kings, and the imposition of tribute. None of this happened. Instead, after Qarqar, Shalmaneser withdrew. The coalition kingdoms remained independent. Damascus was not conquered. Israel continued to exist. Hamath was not destroyed. For years afterward, Assyrian campaigns returned to the region, suggesting that Qarqar had not achieved the decisive result the inscriptions proclaimed. This contradiction lies at the heart of the battle's mystery. From a military perspective, Qarqar appears to have been a brutal stalemate. Assyria may have inflicted heavy losses, as it often did, but the coalition succeeded in its primary objective, stopping the Assyrian advance. The empire that had swept aside isolated enemies now faced a united front it could not easily overcome in open battle. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For the first time in generations, Assyria had met resistance that did not collapse. The aura of inevitability surrounding imperial conquest was cracked, if not shattered. Even a failure to achieve decisive victory carried consequences, encouraging future resistance and forcing Assyria to reconsider its approach. As evening fell over the Orontes Valley, the battlefield was littered with broken weapons, shattered chariots, and the bodies of the fallen. Fires burned where camps had stood. Survivors searched for comrades in the fading light. No triumphant march followed, no city gates fell in the aftermath. Qarqar ended not with clear victory, but with unresolved tension, a battle claimed by Assyria, resisted by history, and remembered as a turning point. It was a day of fire and iron, where empire met unity, and discovered that conquest was not always inevitable. Everything we know about the Battle of Qarqar comes filtered through a single, deeply biased voice, that of the Assyrian king himself. The primary source for the battle is an inscription carved into stone, known today as the Qarqar monolith. Discovered in southeastern Anatolia in the 19th century, this monument records the military campaigns of Shalmaneser III and stands as both a historical treasure and a cautionary warning. The monolith presents Qarqar as a resounding Assyrian victory. In its cuneiform lines, Shalmaneser boasts of confronting a massive enemy alliance, listing its kings, their forces, and the scale of the battle. He claims to have defeated them utterly, killing thousands of soldiers and destroying countless chariots. The language is confident, triumphant, and absolute, exactly what one would expect from an imperial inscription intended to glorify a ruler and intimidate future enemies. Yet Assyrian royal inscriptions were never neutral records of events. They were instruments of state power, designed to project strength, inevitability, and divine favor. Kings were expected to win. To admit defeat or even stalemate would be unthinkable. Failure risked rebellion at home and resistance abroad. Victory, therefore, was not merely reported, it was proclaimed into existence. This is where historians must read between the lines. The Qarqar monolith lists the coalition's leaders with remarkable precision, including Hadadezer of Damascus and Ahab of Israel, along with detailed and almost certainly exaggerated troop numbers. While the inclusion of these names confirms the historical reality of the alliance, the scale of destruction claimed raises doubts. Assyrian inscriptions routinely inflated enemy losses while minimizing their own, a pattern well established across centuries of Assyrian rule. More telling than what the inscription says is what followed after Qarqar. If Shalmaneser had truly annihilated the coalition, Assyrian practice suggests clear consequences would have followed: conquered cities, captured kings, imposed tribute, and deported populations. Yet none of this occurred. Damascus remained independent for years. Israel continued to function as a regional power. Hamath survived. Shalmaneser would campaign again in the west multiple times, a clear indication that Assyrian control had not been secured. This disconnect between claim and outcome has led many modern scholars to interpret Qarqar not as an Assyrian victory, but as a strategic failure or, at best, a costly draw. The Assyrian army may have inflicted damage and forced a withdrawal, but it failed to achieve its primary objective, the permanent subjugation of the Western kingdoms. The Qarqar monolith, therefore, tells us less about what happened on the battlefield and more about how Assyria needed the battle to be remembered. By carving victory into stone, Shalmaneser preserved the image of imperial dominance, regardless of the reality. Stone could lie, but stone could also endure. For historians, Qarqar becomes a case study in how power shapes memory. Without Assyrian inscriptions, the battle might have vanished from history entirely. Yet, because the only surviving narrative comes from the victor's pen, modern scholarship must approach it with skepticism and restraint. The truth of Qarqar likely lies between the lines of the monolith, in what it omits, exaggerates, and reframes. It reminds us that ancient history is not merely about events, but about who had the authority to record them. At Qarqar, Assyria wrote victory into stone. History, however, remains unconvinced. The dust settled over the Orontes Valley, but the consequences of Qarqar echoed far beyond the battlefield. In the immediate aftermath, there was no dramatic collapse of kingdoms, no captured kings paraded in chains, no cities reduced to ash. This absence speaks louder than any inscription. Whatever Shalmaneser III proclaimed, the political reality of the Levant remained largely unchanged. In the years following 853 BCE, the coalition states continued to exist as independent powers. Damascus remained unconquered and defiant. Israel retained its territorial integrity. Hamath survived. Phoenician cities continued to trade across the Mediterranean. For an empire accustomed to turning battlefield success into permanent domination, this was a significant departure from the norm. Assyria did not abandon its western ambitions, but its momentum had been checked. Shalmaneser III would return to the Levant multiple times in subsequent years, fighting many of the same opponents again and again. This repetition is crucial. It suggests that Qarqar had not resolved the struggle, and that Assyria had failed to impose lasting control through a single decisive campaign. For the Western kingdoms, Qarqar proved that resistance was possible. The coalition did not destroy Assyria's army, nor did it end the imperial threat. But it achieved something unprecedented. It survived a direct confrontation with the greatest military power of the age. This survival bought time, years, even decades, during which local states could recover, adapt, and maneuver diplomatically. The psychological impact was profound. Assyria's aura of inevitability had been challenged. The idea that empire could be delayed, resisted, and negotiated with began to take hold. Future rebellions and alliances across the Near East would draw, consciously or not, from the precedent set at Qarqar. Unity could blunt imperial force. Yet the victory was incomplete and fragile. The coalition itself was temporary, bound together only by immediate danger. Old rivalries soon resurfaced. Without constant coordination, the Western kingdoms gradually became vulnerable once more. Over the following decades, Assyria would adapt, refining its military tactics, exploiting divisions, and eventually succeeding where it had once stalled. By the early 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire would dominate much of the Levant, reshaping the region through conquest, deportation, and administration. Qarqar did not stop this outcome, but it delayed it. And in history, delay can matter as much as defeat. The battle stands as a reminder that empires are not challenged only by force, but by cooperation. Qarqar did not end Assyrian expansion, but it exposed its limits. It showed that even the most powerful empire could be held at bay, if only for a time, when rivals chose unity over rivalry. In that sense, Qarqar was more than a battle. It was a moment when history briefly turned on collective resistance and proved that empire was not destiny written in stone. More than 2,500 years after the clash at Qarqar, the battle remains unresolved, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of historians. Unlike many ancient confrontations, Qarqar survives through a single dominant narrative carved into stone by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. The Qarqar monolith stands as both our most valuable source and our greatest obstacle, offering detail without neutrality, confidence without balance. Modern scholarship approaches Qarqar with caution. Assyrian royal inscriptions were never intended as objective history. They were political instruments designed to affirm royal authority, divine favor, and imperial inevitability. Victory was not simply reported, it was required. Defeat, or even indecision, had no place in the official memory of empire. As a result, historians must weigh Shalmaneser's claims against what followed the battle, not just what was proclaimed. And what followed is telling. If Qarqar had been the crushing Assyrian victory described in the inscription, the political landscape of the Levant would have changed immediately. Cities would have fallen. Kings would have disappeared from the record. Tribute would have flowed. Instead, the same rulers and kingdoms reappear in later campaigns, still resisting, still independent. Damascus survives. Israel endures. Hamath remains standing. Assyria returns again and again, fighting the same war it claimed to have already won. For many historians, this contradiction defines Qarqar. Increasingly, the battle is understood not as a decisive Assyrian triumph, but as a strategic stalemate, perhaps even a failure to achieve imperial objectives. Assyria may have inflicted heavy losses and claimed the field, but it did not secure control. The coalition, fragmented and temporary though it was, succeeded in its primary goal, stopping the advance of empire. Archaeology offers little resolution. No confirmed battlefield remains have been identified, and the precise location of ancient Qarqar is still debated. This silence in the soil reinforces a broader truth. Ancient history often survives not through physical evidence, but through interpretation, and interpretation must remain flexible. Yet Qarqar's importance does not rest solely on its outcome. It matters because it represents the earliest clearly documented example of collective resistance to imperial expansion. Long before formal alliances or modern diplomacy, rival kings recognized that survival required cooperation. At Qarqar, unity replaced rivalry, if only briefly, and that choice altered the course of events. Empires are remembered for conquest, for monuments, for permanence. Resistance is often remembered only when it fails. Qarqar stands apart because resistance succeeded just enough to matter. It delayed domination. It challenged inevitability. It proved that even the most powerful empire could be slowed when confronted by unity. Assyria would eventually prevail in the Levant. Time, adaptation, and division would erode what cooperation had achieved. But the legacy of Qarqar endured as precedent, a reminder that empire is not fate, and that history is shaped not only by those who carve their victories into stone, but by those who stand together when defeat seems certain. At Qarqar, the ancient world did not defeat empire, but it learned how to resist it, and in doing so, changed history.